PlayStation 4 is the last Sony console that can truly be called next-gen. It delivered a real leap in graphics and technology, despite its modest hardware, which was considered outdated right from the start. Sony immediately set out to fix the problems of the PlayStation 3 and, unlike the PlayStation 5, introduced many important features throughout the entire lifecycle, delighting us with new exclusives for the whole generation. And I preferred to play on it even though my PC was several times more powerful. Hi, my name is Lovchan. Today I'll share my 7 years of experience owning a PlayStation, prove that it's the best console in Sony's history, and try to figure out how they achieved this. And to help me understand the hardware and graphic side of things, I've invited a fan of beautiful visuals from the Gadre channel and at the same time, my friend Ilya.
Hey there everyone!
But we'll need this secret tool a bit later. For now, let's start with how this generation began. After the not-so-successful launch of the PS3, Sony couldn't afford to take risks anymore, so they decided to switch to the x86 architecture. This allowed developers to immediately apply their experience with PCs and focus on creativity instead of struggling with the hardware. It also made porting games easier, which was especially appreciated by indie studios. Sony finally allowed them to publish without a publisher. And although developers needed a bit of time to adapt, the first true next-gen title, infamous Second Son, was released just 4 months later. Even the competitors played into Sony's hands by shooting themselves in the foot. May 2013. Xbox is positioned as a $500 TV with mandatory online check-ins every 24 hours and Connect included. And right before E3, new details emerge about restrictions on sharing and reselling discs. Rumor has it that Sony wanted to do the same, but after seeing the crowd's reaction, they quickly backtracked. As a result, at E3 they destroyed Microsoft by announcing that there would be no new restrictions, and their console would be $100 cheaper. A couple of hours later, they released a hastily made commercial mocking Microsoft. Of course, in the end, Microsoft cancelled all the restrictions, but it was already too late. The PlayStation became the people's console, while Xbox was seen as a greedy set-top box. Still, the PS4 launch wasn't perfect. There were technical issues, and on launch day, players crashed PSN trying to download the Day 1 patch. This happened even though online play was now paid. Still, compared to the disaster of the previous generation, the launch seemed perfect. According to Sony, the actual defect rate was less than 0.5%. But the successful launch is only the beginning. True success lay in understanding the player's pain. Don't want to buy a capture card? Exactly. Here's the share button for you, with screenshots, background video recording, and the ability to stream on Twitch and YouTube. No voice chat in games? No problem. Here's a system-level Discord equivalent for you, and if you get stuck in a game, just hand over control to a friend through SharePlay. In this generation, Sony put a major emphasis on social features. They even added a Facebook-style news feed. But PlayStation became more user-friendly even for those who don't have any friends. Now, you didn't have to turn off your console, you could just put it into sleep mode and it would download games and updates in the background while charging the controller at the same time. A bit later, the console even learned to keep a game running in the background so you wouldn't have to start it from the beginning. Finally, downloading and installing games became a single unified process. Now you could start playing before the game was fully downloaded, and thanks to Remote Play, you could play games on the PS Vita, later on PC, and, crazy as it sounds, even much later on your phone. Multitasking even appeared, although it was quite limited, but one of the main pains of the previous generation was the gamepad, which was designed for people with small hands. That's why the new DualShock became not just more comfortable, but also more practical. Rather than buying an expensive headset, you could plug headphones into the controller, and text input was simplified by a touchpad and improved gyroscope. A light bar was also added. It initially reflected off the TV screen until adjustable settings were added. And understanding the player's pain wasn't limited to new features at launch. The console wasn't perfect, but with every major update, it got better, even if some things appeared later than we would have liked. Folders for games and the ability to record up to an hour of video only came with an update in 2016. But on the bright side, the package included a surprise in the form of HDR. The most interesting thing is that it even worked on the original models, which theoretically shouldn't have supported it due to the old architecture and outdated HDMI 1.4. But Sony updated the converter driver, teaching it to hide HDR data inside the stream. However, the actual HDR settings were only added 3 years later. In 2017, they added the ability to launch games from external drives, custom wallpapers, and notification clearing. Honestly, these features could have come much earlier. Around the same time, party size increased to 16 people and got improved audio, as well as transcription for the hearing impaired. To be fair, the PS5 also gets updates, but no patch on the PS5 has come close to the HDR update on the PS4. Quad HD, VRR, a working memory expansion slot. These aren't features, they're basic necessities that we didn't get at launch. They even removed folders on the PlayStation 5 at first, and then brought them back in a limited form. and I still don't understand why they got rid of proper customization only to later add some clunky themes and widgets to the main screen. By the way, the PS5 doesn't have a browser either. Basically, they overhauled the interface not for convenience but just for the sake of change, even though all they really needed to do was just refresh the style. But at the time of the PlayStation 4's release, most players were hung up on the tablet-grade processor and low-end graphics card. Ilya, was it really that bad?
8 async cores, parallelism, multi-threaded shaders, GDDR5, 176 GB SL.
No. Wait.
We already discussed this. Please explain it like a normal person.
Well, despite the fact that the CPU only had a core frequency of 1.6 GHz and a graphics card roughly on the level of an HD 7850, the PlayStation 4 actually had several interesting and non-obvious features that allowed it to deliver a very high level of graphics in games of its time compared to PCs, even in multi-platform projects, not to mention games developed and optimized exclusively for PlayStation 4 hardware. Infamous Second Son, The Order, 1886, and Uncharted 4 are just a few examples of stunning graphical detail that showcase the full power of the PlayStation 4, which remained impressive for a long time, even compared to much more powerful PCs. For example, with the PlayStation 5, the situation is radically different. At launch, aside from the SSD, it had no advantages over any PC, because an owner of, say, a 2060 Super could simply enable DLSS to make up for the lack of raw power, plus turn on ray tracing, increase texture and effects quality, and thereby significantly improve graphics quality beyond the level of the PlayStation 5, even with much weaker hardware.
But back in the days of the PS4, nothing like that existed.
Exactly. The most you could improve was the draw distance, texture and shadow filtering, and that was usually where any real quality enhancements ended. That happened because the PS4 had 4.5 GB of fast GDDR5 memory, fully available to developers for games. However, under certain conditions, this limit could be increased to 5.5 GB. For comparison, even the top-end R9 only had 4 GB. Only more expensive cards had more, like the Titan, which cost $1,000, so the PlayStation 4 could easily afford, for example, maximum quality textures. For comparison, the PlayStation 5 has 12.5 GB available for games, which is only on par with the mid-range RX 6700 XT and is significantly behind the top cards with 16 GB of VRAM. Additionally, in contrast to standard personal computers, the PlayStation 4 featured a unified memory architecture, which allowed the GPU to directly access game resources, boosting overall performance and providing significantly higher memory speeds.
Wait, so a $400 gaming console had more memory than the high-end R9
Moreover, the PlayStation 4 also had so-called asynchronous engines, which allowed the graphics processor to avoid idle time and accomplish more work per unit of time. And there were just as many of them as in the top-tier R9 which cost $400. The use of compute shaders became a separate lifesaver for developers. A feature that had long been available on PC also became accessible on PlayStation 4, allowing developers to program the GPU not just for fixed tasks, but for a wide variety of purposes, like calculating tens of thousands of particles on screen in Infamous, or complex tiled lighting in The Order, 1886. At the same time, compute shaders also helped partially offload the PlayStation 4's central processor, which despite its cores running at only 1.6 GHz, still had one important advantage: multi-threaded rendering, allowing tasks to be efficiently parallelized across 7 cores. Since one core was reserved for the system, while most computers had 2 or 4 processor cores and not every game could even use them efficiently. All of this combined allowed the PlayStation 4 to consistently deliver good visuals at 1080p resolution and 30 FPS. Yes, not all games ran perfectly, but it's important to remember that 1080p resolution, while not impressive now, was available to only about 30% of players at the start of the PlayStation 4 generation, according to Steam statistics. Of course, despite the console's inevitable technological lag, especially with the emergence of new generations of graphics cards, the PlayStation 4 remained a relevant and affordable gaming device right up until the end of its life cycle. For example, from 2017 to 2018, during the first mining boom, as veterans will remember, the most reasonable of the cheap graphics cards, the GTX 1050 Ti, cost $250 or more due to shortages, coming close to the price of a brand new PlayStation 4 Slim at $300. At the same time, it had slightly less memory for games and a depleted 128-bit bus with a bandwidth a third lower than that of the PlayStation.
And this generation? Did the SSD not make a difference?
The holy SSD, which was actually used as intended in only a handful of games, is of course cool, but literally 2 years later, comparable SSDs at reasonable prices were already available on the market for PCs as well. But as for games that actually use its capabilities, there haven't really been any more of them. Unfortunately, as much as it might not have seemed that way at first, the PlayStation 5 was already outdated at launch, whereas the PlayStation 4, thanks to its well-designed technical foundation, remained a relevant gaming device for many years.
But enough about the specs. Let's move on to the real experience. I wanted to buy a PS4 in 2015 after watching playthroughs of The Last of Us and Uncharted. At that time, I didn't care about its power. All that mattered to me was that story-driven games had become my favorite genre, and often the best ones were Sony exclusives. 6 months later, Uncharted 4 was released. I, a 15-year-old schoolboy, wake up early in the morning to go back home after staying at my godmother's place. I go on YouTube and see the first episode of a playthrough, which I immediately download to my tablet. I still remember watching that video on a shaky bus, and when I got home, I skipped school and watched the playthrough on the TV, realizing how much I was missing out on without a console. By the end of that year, the second part of The Last of Us was announced. After that, I had no more doubts. I had to save up for a console and play it at launch. By the time I finished school, I had decided to buy it, but since I didn't have the full amount, I ordered it 3 months later when my dad chipped in some money, even though the console had become noticeably more expensive. I remember very clearly how I found out that the console was about to arrive. For me, it was a ticket to the world of my favorite games, a moment when only a few days remained before my dream would come true. But there was one more problem. I placed the order at a no-name store because the price was lower. And then the phone rang.
Unfortunately, the standard edition is out of stock, but we do have a bundle. We can take the disc out of it and make it a bit cheaper. Would that work for you?
So I agreed. Now just imagine how shocked I was when I found out that I saved a measly $18, but the disc they took from me had the new God of War on it. Of course, I later called the store and threatened to raise hell about their company, but all I got in response was some nonsense about how it was just some old game in there. But neither I nor my console argued with that. Even though the situation with the store turned out to be unpleasant, it didn't really matter. I took a friend's account and, after returning from the post office, started testing the console while the games downloaded. By evening, I could finally play properly. Back at the dacha, I finally played through The Last of Us on my own. Honestly, I was a bit disappointed. Playing with the gamepad was hard at first, which spoiled the experience a bit. By the way, I bought Uncharted on disc, but the game didn't run very well without the patch, and since there was no decent internet at the dacha, I had to go home to download updates. Now I remember those moments with special fondness. It was especially fun with the game days gone. Even months after release, patches for it were coming out almost every day, and their size was about half the size of the game itself. Now it plays great, but back then the game could freeze for 3 seconds at a time, though even that didn't ruin the fun. One winter, I went to download the game and slipped on the ice on the way with the console in my backpack. The top cover popped off. I was really scared, thinking it was broken. For the next 20 minutes I walked home terrified that it wouldn't work. I think the fact that everything turned out fine is a huge achievement for Sony's engineers. Personally, I think the design of the PS4 Slim is the ideal of practical aesthetics. It's very convenient to carry in a backpack thanks to its rounded corners. It's a quarter lighter and thinner than the fat model, and its flat matty edges distribute the weight evenly and do not get scratched, unlike the PS5. Plus, it doesn't get as hot and, as a result, is more reliable and quieter. But the fat model also deserves praise for its internal power supply, which the Xbox didn't have despite its large size. Although the Slim also has some glossy plastic, it's not very noticeable, and the controller that came with it was already matte, with a cutout for the light bar in the touchpad. I'll never understand why Sony keeps going back to glossy finishes time and again. Apparently it's become a tradition. And yet it's hard to describe the feelings the console evoked in those first days. All the games felt different. If 30 frames per second was a problem for me on PC, here it was the norm. Yes, there were games like Far Cry 3 that lacked smoothness, but maybe it's just a matter of getting used to it. I thoroughly enjoyed playing through many of the PS3 era exclusives and finally completed GTA 5. I can't explain why, but by the time I had a decent PC, I no longer felt like playing through the story. Only on the PlayStation was I able to get the experience I had dreamed of. This might be hard to understand for those used to playing on PC, but it wasn't about the FPS, it was about the console itself and its philosophy, which I'll talk about later. Once I got the PlayStation, I could finally play all those games myself that I'd only ever seen on YouTube. YouTube through the lens of low bitrate. Even when I played games I had already played on PC, I got new impressions and reinterpreted projects that I thought could no longer surprise me. And just this feeling alone already made the console worth it. Take the Metro series. whose atmosphere I loved on PlayStation. But the PS4 exclusives felt truly next-gen, even late in the cycle. After The Last of Us, Sony's games leaned further into cinema. That's how Until Dawn defined the slasher genre. Thanks to it, I could personally experience how hard it can be not to freeze up at a crucial moment, and Order 1886 played the role of a Victorian steampunk action game, which made me feel like a character from a Guy Ritchie movie. And even though I'm not a fan of post-apocalyptic sci-fi, I really enjoyed the action RPG Horizon Zero Dawn, but in the first few months I was playing the then new Detroit. It was like a whole mini-series with an amazingly variable storyline and dozens of different endings. And only after that did I buy Uncharted 4, which within the series embodied the shift to a slower, more cinematic pace. For the first time, the gameplay flowed so smoothly into cutscenes, which were now rendered in real time. Also, thanks to the increased power of the console, the number of facial expressions increased sevenfold, which, combined with detailed character models, allowed me to better understand the characters' emotions. The direction also improved. Since the third installment, the cinematography and shot composition matched a major film, and the smooth animations and combat scenes allowed us to feel like Indiana Jones. I was especially pleasantly surprised by Days Gone, which I hadn't expected much from. I would get hooked on it for 5 hours at a time despite all the performance issues. At the time of its release, it was often criticized for being derivative. It seemed as if none of the critics noticed how alive the characters in this game were, unlike the players who truly appreciated it. Among Sony's games, it stood out with its dynamic graphics. The day and night cycle, varied weather, and shadows from every single blade of grass were rendered not on the studio's in-house engine but on Unreal Engine 4. But perhaps the real next-gen experience for me was The Last of Us Part 2. It was the most anticipated game of my life. It amazed with its animations and visuals ever since the first trailer back in 2018. And it did not disappoint. The moment it was released is something I will remember forever. At that moment, I felt a connection with millions of players and especially appreciated the emotions that a console can deliver. This game squeezed every last drop out of the PlayStation and became its final exclusive. And I would always prefer to play any Sony games on consoles even though the graphics there might be worse. Their main feature is that this device is made exclusively for gaming. When you buy a PlayStation, you take the responsibility off yourself. Unlike on PC, you don't need to mess around with graphics settings, overclock your hardware, or fix issues in the game's config. If a game lags, it's either because the console can't handle it, or it'll be fixed with a patch. Not having to figure things out gives you freedom. On PC, you can solve any problem, but sometimes you have to do it and that distracts you from playing. For example, HDR on Windows works poorly, and you have to fix it yourself or play without it. Every platform has its drawbacks, but only a few people had consoles, and that made them special. Maybe that's why, in my circle, owning a PS4 was a status symbol. It offered a completely different experience thanks to exclusives and the ability to play with friends on the same couch. And the high prices for games and the lack of piracy made the console seem elite in the eyes of a PC gamer. When I bought a PlayStation, I felt like part of a closed club because of its soul, which had been shaped over the years. It's made up of countless little things, from the hardware and appearance to the console's interface, which always amazed me. Those large game tiles, the ability to set your own theme, and the absence of unnecessary elements all remind me of a cozy home that you enjoy coming back to. This menu became a lasting symbol of an era when the gaming industry knew how to take bold risks, and the PlayStation brand was built on great games and comfort. Console hardware changes in cycles, and in the past, each new generation brought revolutionary graphics, but we've already passed the point where doubling the number of polygons radically changed the visuals. The graphics on the PS4 were already quite realistic, and the transition to the PS5 is more of an evolution, a logical step from static to dynamic. This is mainly achieved through ray tracing, in which the PlayStation 5 noticeably lags behind PCs. Previously, the word next-gen meant faith in the future, a hope not just for upgraded graphics but for a real leap in gameplay quality. We were waiting for more vibrant worlds, advanced physics, and real-time destructibility. But now it feels like Sony doesn't really understand how hardware is evolving and isn't building in enough potential. That's why a full-fledged DLSS equivalent could only be implemented with the PlayStation 5 Pro. And miracles like HDR appearing on the old console won't happen anymore, so the new console now feels like resetting your graphics card without any way to improve the visuals. Unfortunately, the era of next-gen has passed. Do you even realize that the previous generation was the last time consoles actually got cheaper? If the PS4 dropped $100, the PS5, on the contrary, costs more now than it did at launch. And that's just the recommended prices. I don't even want to talk about all the shortages that happen every couple of years. Plus, manufacturing isn't advancing, so console production costs aren't dropping. Xbox is hardly a competitor now. In the previous generation, there were 27 exclusives, while this gen has only 11, and 3 are remakes. Instead of new games, we're being offered graphics settings for $10 a piece. Only now has Sony realized what the PlayStation brand should be built on after 4 years of investing in live service games that ended up being cancelled. But the truth is that most of this generation has already passed, and it's too late to fix that now, especially considering that developing new games is now several times more expensive. Perhaps the memory shortage and the delayed release of the new generation will give the PS5 a chance to redeem itself, just as the PlayStation 3 once did. After all, what we need are games, not new hardware. I want to believe that the PS5 still has a chance. Maybe it will be able to set standards, just like the PS4 did. Throughout its generation, it proved the importance of good story-driven games, paved the way for indie titles, and made 1080p an almost unbreakable standard, something the new generation lacks. Sony was the first to integrate the share button, which became a benchmark for Xbox, just like releasing a more powerful 4K console mid-generation. PlayStation, along with Xbox, made HDR content accessible. However, unlike its competitors, Microsoft was never able to implement it in the original TV box. But is the PlayStation 4 still relevant today? No, but actually yes. Look, if your goal is to play current games, you won't find them here. Of course, some things will still be released, like expansions for Diablo 4 or some indie titles, but that's about it. At the same time, many games and services like Fortnite are still supported, and despite the console's age, the player base is simply huge. But there's something else. A few years ago, a trend began for old devices that can only perform one function at a time. As a result, neither the PlayStation Vita nor even ancient point-and-shoot cameras can be found at reasonable prices these days. Many people are giving up streaming services, digging out their old iPods, and reminiscing about the best years of their lives. Although I prefer listening to Spotify with wireless headphones, I completely understand why this is happening. I'm still perfectly comfortable playing on the PS4. Games look even better on modern televisions, and to this day, the DualShock 4 feels more comfortable in my hands than the DualSense. Now, in the era of doomscrolling, it's especially valuable to grab a gamepad, flop down on the couch, and launch a favorite game from your past. And the PS4 is perfect for that. For me, it became a way to truly experience the games that shaped who I am. Thanks to it, I fell in love all over again with things I once considered ordinary. Owning this device was an immense pleasure. It never let me down once. I will be deeply and eternally grateful to the games of the previous generation, for the people I connected with and the powerful emotions I experienced. If you had a PlayStation 4, share your experience in the comments. In the last video, we got a lot of cool stories, and I really enjoyed reading them. Be sure to check out the video about the PlayStation 3, and don't forget to watch Ilya's video about graphics in Sony exclusives. Bye.